started. And you will have the opportunity to access this online after the program. So welcome everyone. I'm super excited to have you all with us today. I'm Jacqueline from Composer, and I'm here today with 4 amazing panelists who I will introduce shortly, as well as my colleague Kristen Green from High Resolves. Really excited to have this panel of experts today and educators. Really excited for all of you to join us on this really important discussion around teaching tough history through a civics and SEL lens and what that means and how that can support our students. So I will start off today by giving an intro to Composer. If you're new to Composer, welcome. If you're not new to Composer, thank you for coming to another one of our webinars. I'll explain a little bit about our curriculum design framework. I'll introduce our partners. You'll get a chance to hear from them about their organizations, the work that they do. And then you'll get to hear from Sean, one of Composer's educators, on a curriculum that he designed, and we'll dig into that together. Then move into a panel discussion on our topic of civics and social emotional learning in history. And then we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. So again, welcome to our partners. Really excited to have you all with us today. I'm really thankful for your partnership and participation in this program. So if you can just wave when I say your name so everyone can put a name to the face. We have Michelle Bertoli, the Senior Director of Learning from iThrive Games. Hi, Michelle. We have Frank Stebbins, the Senior Program Associate for New Jersey Growth and Strategy from Facing History and Ourselves. Hi, Frank. We have Juanita Montes de Oca from GenCitizen, the Senior Manager of National Program and Curriculum Development. Hi, Juanita, thank you. And then we have Sean Clybor, who is a teacher, a writer, a researcher, and he is one of our very valuable members of the Composer Educator Advisory. So thank you all for being with us. So I'll start off by sharing a little bit about Composer if it's new to you. Composer is a global marketplace for educators to access and design high impact curriculum in citizenship education. So we are a digital platform, a digital tool, and you can both access content on there. We have a library of over 1,000 learning experiences from different organizations, and it's also a curriculum design tool. It's very interactive and it's grounded in insights from learning science. And we'll go into that more shortly. So what do we mean by citizenship education? Citizenship education we think of as education that equips the next generation to act for the well-being of themselves, their communities, and the planet. And we also think of it through 4 different content areas of global competence, social emotional learning, social justice, and civic learning. And together, these 4 areas fall under this more umbrella term of citizenship education. And so at Composer, we source our content from over 35 different organizations who are all represented here on this slide. Some of these you may recognize as very large organizations, and others are also smaller. Most are based in the US, some also in Australia, but they're all very, very dedicated to creating content that supports educators in helping their students grow as citizens of the world, as thoughtful and engaged members of society. So we work with all of these content providers to bring you Composer and really rich, impactful content. So a little bit about our curriculum design framework and how you can use Composer to design curriculum. So at Composer, we support educators in using the platform to design for student mastery. And we do this by translating all of our content from all those different providers into a common visual language. And we do this through a common visual these different shapes, and then also by definitions. So an element is what we think of as a single learning experience, and a string is a sequence of learning experiences. So a string can also be thought of as curricula, a unit, a learning journey even. and it incorporates 3 different types of elements. So these 3 different shapes represent 3 different types of elements, and these represent 3 different parts of a learning journey. And so this is backed by learning science that teaches us how the brain learns and that describes the different sorts of experiences that help learning stick over time and make an impact on the learner. So the first type of learning experience or element is a peak experience, and these are represented by triangles on Composer. The purpose is to introduce new knowledge to a student and demonstrate the value of that new knowledge, provide motivation for them to want to learn more. Some examples include workshops, museum visits, powerful films. These are usually very immersive experiences and help the student have a sort of aha moment or even a paradigm shift and want to learn more about the topic. The second element type, which is sort of your bread and butter, is a repeated practice, and these are represented on Composer by squares. And the purpose is to move that new knowledge that was gained in the peak experience into more long-term memory and provide opportunities for students to practice that knowledge over and over again. You can think of these as your more traditional classroom lessons, such as reading and writing, exercises, in-class activities, and they're generally limited to a classroom setting. And then finally, the real-world application, which is represented by circles on Composer, is a culmination of effective practice. So it's the opportunity for students to apply what they've learned in the classroom to outside of the classroom. And these are usually the most challenging of a sequence of elements and of the 3 types. They're also usually action-based, and some examples include community projects, service learning, digital campaigns. So these 3 element types together, we combine on Composer to create a string. And so a string, again, you can think of as a unit or a learning journey. So you can pick a topic or theme and then create a complete learning journey or string around that topic or theme using the 3 different elements. And this ensures that the new knowledge or skills that students are gaining over that course of the string really sticks at the end with incorporating those 3 different element types. So these are some tips for creating your strings on Composer. One is to draft the learning outcomes, to frame the string as a whole, as a holistic experience together, and be explicit on goals. Start with a peak experience so that students have that aha moment and that motivation at the beginning of the sequence, and then have a real-world application towards the end to give that opportunity for them to apply their new skills into the real world. And then to have, of course, the practice in the middle where they can build those skills over time, increasing in complexity, and then apply them at the end. So if you're wondering, how am I going to remember all of these pieces? This looks complicated. Don't worry. On Composer, we have a built-in guidance and rules that will help you build your string. So on Composer, this is a screenshot just of our Create Studio. And you can go in there and you can pull out elements from different providers in different topics, the different element types, and you can sequence them together here in our Create Studio. And as you go, you'll be prompted on how to make your string stronger. So as you can see on the right, we have this little string meter that tells us the strength of the string. And as you go and the string becomes longer and stronger according to learning science, the percentage will go up and it will become green. And so as you go, you can sort of see the impact that your string will have on students and are guided as you go along. And that way you feel supported in having a string that supports students in mastery of a topic or skill. All right, so I will now turn it over to each of our content partners to give a little short overview of each of their organizations and also themselves and the work that they do. And we will kick off with Michelle.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks so much for having me on the panel here tonight. I'm Michelle Bertoli. I am the Senior Director of Learning for iThrive Games Foundation. And my professional background is in social and emotional learning. I've been in that field for just over a decade, helping to both research and design SEL efforts for pre-K through 12th grade. So iThrive's mission is really to prepare teens to thrive by meeting them where they are, and working in partnership towards a world where all have the voice, choice, and agency to reach their full potential. So in order to do that, we actively engage and co-create with young people and educators to build game-based learning tools and experiences that infuse social and emotional learning opportunities at the core of civics and humanities instruction. So among other tools, we offer immersive civics simulations in the form of iThrive Sim, and also curricular units that use games as the central, game narratives as the central texts, all in the service of really equipping teens with curiosity, practical experience, civic and social emotional skills they need to navigate a really complex world. So I invite you to check out our offerings at iThrivegames.org, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Pass it along.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Really, really thrilled to have you, and definitely check out iThrive Games. It's a really incredible, they have some really incredible content and role-playing simulations as well that are very unique. So next up, I'll pass it to Frank from Facing History and Ourselves.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure being here with my co-panelists, and thank you to our participants for taking the time out of your schedule to join us tonight. I look forward to being in conversation with all of you. Before joining Facing History and Ourselves, I was a 17-year classroom educator, starting my career off in elementary school, and then spending the last 10 years at the high school level teaching mainly an elective in Holocaust and genocide studies. If you're unfamiliar with Facing History and Ourselves, we are a 40-plus-year-old educational organization that supports social emotional learning, equity, and civic education in schools around the United States and internationally. Our work is rooted in the principles of adolescent development based in classroom experience and oriented towards engaging with difficult moments in history to make essential connections between the past and the choices we face today. Facing History and Ourselves uses lessons of history to challenge teachers and their students to stand up to bigotry and hate. Our resources examine our collective history and how it informs our present attitudes and behaviors. Through resources that address racism, anti-Semitism, and prejudice at pivotal moments in history, we help students connect choices made in the past with those they will confront in their own lives. We also realize that this kind of learning involves the whole student, not just their minds, but also their heart and their conscience. Facing History's pedagogical approach represents the pillars of our practice: intellectual rigor, emotional engagement, and ethical reflection. All of our programs, our curriculum, resources, teaching strategies, and professional development are designed around those core principles. And like I said before, I'm really looking forward to discussing some of those resources as well as the other resources included in the string tonight. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank, for that great intro. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Facing History, but also, Frank, thank you for the lovely framing for the holisticness of the approach, as we'll definitely get into that more. And I will pass it over to Juanita from Generation Citizen.
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. So my name is Juanita. I'm GC's Senior Manager of National Program and Curricular Development. As such, I support programming across our sites, across our nation. We have 6 sites across the country, as well as some remote partners. And I also lead our curricular innovations across the organization. Before this, I was a middle school teacher here in Providence, Rhode Island, where I'm based. And there I taught social studies and GC's Action Civics curriculum. It was honestly the best part of my day. I love teaching this program, and it basically because it sparked so much joy in our students. They had the opportunity to experience what government does and how it functions by actually participating in government. Our students go through the process of Action Civics, where they select a community issue via consensus building. They narrow it down to a focus issue, which, as you know, with young people, that could be a little bit challenging. A lot of young people are really passionate about a lot of things. So they learn how to collaborate, how to respect each other's opinions, and all of the wonderful things that we want them to do as engaged citizens. And from there, they research the topic. They learn in the community what is going on, what impact it's having on their community, and what things they could be doing to help potentially create systemic change via a policy goal, where they then create an action plan and actually implement their policy goals. So they do things like try to support English language learners in their community by advocating for more funding for teachers to get certified, which is an issue we've had here in Providence, and one of my classes worked on. And eventually that did work, and more teachers were able to become certified, which is really exciting. So it's really exciting to see this because there is a clear connection between SEL and civics, and action civics in particular. So I'm excited to learn more about this and talk more about this with you guys.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Juanita. Definitely check out Generation Citizen's content on Composer as well. Also, Generation Citizen was one of the first providers on Composer, and we're really thankful for your partnership. So thank you for being here. Wonderful. So now I will turn it over to Sean to share a little bit about the string that he created. If I can move my screen. So Sean, you can, while I'm getting up your string on the screen, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Sean Clivor, and I have been an educator both in high school and universities for just shy of 15 years now. I've written some articles. Originally, I was more of an academic, wrote some articles on Eastern European history. And then more recently, I've been transitioning into secondary education, specifically history, looking at, for example, like empathy, using empathy in the classroom, or thinking about empathy as a historical skill and how to teach that. So I just want to say, first of all, that I'm really excited to be here today, and it's such an honor and a privilege to be with all of you on the panel and everyone in the audience. I feel slightly responsible for this because the panelists are all here in part because I incorporated your lesson plans into my string. So, and I'm just really thrilled that you all came. I've known your organizations for a long time, Facing History and ourselves I've used in past many times. So it was just really exciting to be here today. So a little bit about the kind of background information to my being here. I was invited to be on the advisory council at Composer beginning last fall in September, and a part of our responsibilities, I guess you could say, or our role, is to work with Composer and to design our own string, and then talk about it. And so I hadn't used Composer much before that time, so it was a relatively new experience to me. So I was a neophyte. So for those of you in the audience who haven't used it before, you don't know what it is, there's not much separating me from you, aside from spending a little bit of time playing around with the site, getting to know it, building a string, and then talking to you now. So when I started my work, I didn't really have an idea of what it was that I wanted to do because I wasn't entirely aware of the extent of the material. I knew a lot of the organizations that were involved, but there were others I didn't. So what I did in the beginning, at the outset, was really just dig into Composer and look by very generalized keywords, skim through them, click on individual providers, both that I knew and that I didn't know, and just get a sense of what was available and what was out there. I was actually organizing it all into a separate string. And I know at one point, Jacqueline checked in on me and was like, "There's a very interesting string you're building." There was like 800 elements in it. It was massive. And that's not what I promise it's not what I'm designing. I'm designing a class from like K through 12 on Composer. So I was mostly collecting just things about history because I was curious to see. I'm a history teacher, social studies, my emphasis on world history. So I was really eager to see what was out there, because oftentimes I think a lot of the social justice oriented, civics oriented curricula that are available online tend to be pretty United States focused. And that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, it's a civics class. Of course, it's going to be focused on the United States. But as a world history teacher, I kind of have that focus outside the US. And so I was really eager to see what I could find there. So I just began by looking for world history. And I decided that I was going to let the materials guide me rather than the other way around, sort of a design thinking principle. And as I began going through the materials and looking at them, what I noticed is that things relating to genocide, nationalism, and ethnic cleansing were popping up pretty frequently across some of the different providers. But then in addition to that, I noticed that there were a lot of really excellent materials focused on social emotional learning and social justice. And some of those lesson plans had been packaged as a part of a more United States or America focused unit. But one of the things that's really awesome about Composer, I have to say, is that it allows you to dig into these different materials from different organizations. And then in a very easy way, in a very visual way, you can begin assembling them together for your own purposes. So it really encourages you to play around and to take things from one site and another site and then mix them up and remix them and appropriate them to your own ends. And I really like that. Like, that to me is awesome. I find a lot of times as an educator, and maybe some of you would agree, that when you find curriculum online, it can be very rigid. You need to do this, and then you do that, and you ask these questions. And that doesn't always work for every classroom, for every environment, for every educator. And so having those options and that choice to build and play around is really important. So the string that I designed, as you can see on the screen here, is called Understanding Genocide. And what I did is I put together did I search for, I'm looking at the QA while I'm presenting, and I should add, feel free to question me at any time. I love having a more dialogic or dialogue-based conversation here. So Lynn asked, do you search for materials within the Composer environment or outside it on the web? And the answer is inside Composer. Everything, there's a search engine, there's a search portal inside Composer. You can see over on the left there. You can break things down by grade level. You can look for, Jacqueline was describing earlier, the peak experiences, repeated experiences, or real world applications. You can narrow it by that. And then you can look for specific keywords, as you can see above, for a lesson plan. And that's where I was looking for originally world history. And then I began looking for genocide to see what would pop up. And then once you do that, you can either favorite the lessons that you find and then it puts them into a favorites list, or you can just begin dumping them into a string, and then you can move them around and cut them or add more later as you need. And that's kind of how I kind of did both, but I sort of ended up dumping everything into the string and then sort of refining it and molding it as I went along. That just sort of works to my own particular style. I began finding a lot of material on genocide and ethnic cleansing. And as an Eastern European historian originally, this is a part of my background. So I've spent a lot of time teaching these topics, going to teaching workshops, doing research into the topics. It was something that I teach courses on nationalism, for example. I'm the depressing history teacher, really. I always joke about that with my students. I'm the guy at the party that no one wants to talk to because he's just going on and on about really depressing stuff. That's me. But I think it's really important to do. And I think Frank alluded to this. I mean, it's a part of our mission, I think, as educators, right? This is a calling as much as it is a profession. Certainly, I wasn't drawn to it for the salary. And so I think as a calling, a part of my calling desire is that I want to leave the world in a better place than when I found it. And when it comes to talking about acts of violence or persecution, whether it's racism, ethnic cleansing, any topic that you look at, what we often say, and this is the adage from the Holocaust, is never again, right? But yet we also say history repeats itself. And that certainly happens. And so we say never again, and then we do the same things that we did before. And then in 10 years, we say never again, and the cycle passes along and along and along. So this is something as an educator that's really vexed me. Is it possible to break that cycle? And if so, what might that look like? And so the reason why I'm talking all about this is because that really is my objective. And that was my objective going into Composer. That was the main thing that I wanted to do in designing the string. So as I built this string with that objective in mind, I went through the lesson plans and I found material that I sort of organized into 3 different categories. And these categories roughly coincided with the shapes, the element, the peak experience, and the repeated practice breakdown of Composer, but not always. So what did I find? First of all, I needed content as a historian. I needed specific case studies or examples that I could use to help develop a comparative framework for understanding genocide. So I pulled in some lessons about the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. I pulled in some lessons, of course, about the Holocaust, although I didn't focus heavily on the Holocaust. I pulled in some lessons on the Japanese occupation of China and Nanjing in the 1930s. And then I pulled in some material on, I'm drawing a blank. What's the 4th piece that I did? I don't remember. It might have only been those 3 at the end. I don't recall. So I took that content, and then from there, I began looking for more social and emotional learning pieces that I could incorporate into this. I found yes, Rwanda, thanks, Frank, yes, Rwanda, and Hotel Rwanda was one of the peak experiences that I added. Yes, Hotel Rwanda. So what I began doing is looking for lesson plans that had a social emotional angle that could help students explore the social psychological components of understanding genocide. What leads us to do these things that happen? And I say we because I think in many ways, I like talking about and thinking about genocide as something that you never really know where it comes from or who's involved or what drives them to it or how they end up participating in it. And that can be, I think, a shocking and scary experience for everyone. But certainly for young people, is thinking about, wow, are the causes that lead to genocide, are those connected to similar things that I see and that I do on the playground? When I outgroup, when I stereotype, when I create in-groups and exclude other people, is that connected to the same impulses that can lead to such acts of violence? And I would say the answer is yes. But exploring that is difficult. It's challenging. It evokes a lot of emotions. It's complex. It's messy. Life is messy. This is very messy. And so having these lesson plans available, I found to be really helpful in terms of thinking about how do you approach these things in a simple way that's very straightforward. Some of the activities are very game-like. You get students up, you get them moving around, you get them engaging with one another. It's a great, way for them to learn. So I brought in a lot of those. And the third thing that I did was think about larger assessments that I could add to the end of the string. What would the outcome of this be? What would the final assessment look like? Because I certainly wouldn't want it to be just a test or an essay. And so when I was designing the string, I actually found two different assessments that could work really well. One of them is an activity, a lesson plan from GenCitizen, that is a write an op-ed activity. And the activity is more open-ended. It says, you can write an op-ed about an issue that's important to you. But I modified that a little bit, or I would modify that a little bit. And for those of you who are going to use Composer, I encourage you to think in similar terms. You can change and modify these lesson plans to suit your own needs. I decided, well, I would change it to students have to write about, they have to find a situation in the contemporary world that is threatening to become or currently in the midst of a genocide, and then to write an op-ed building on the experiences they've had in the unit and the lessons they've learned to build something that responds to it in a way that is preventative. It is a call to action. It is something that is action-oriented. And then the second activity that I did was to part of this incorporated some facing ourselves was to develop a common student universal bill of rights, in the same way that the Universal Charter of Human Rights was issued in, I believe, 48, in part as a response to the Holocaust after 45. I wanted the students at the end of this unit to come together as a class and to think about, well, what are the principles that we should articulate right now as a way of helping prevent something like a genocide or ethnic cleansing happening again? What would that look like? What are the principles that we should be standing up for that we're not currently, or that we could be standing up for better? And so that I really liked. And so I added both of them and figured, I think that this might resonate with some people more than others, and people should have choice in terms of what they do. And by the way, I'll add just very quickly at the end, I haven't mentioned iThrive, but where I included iThrive here is also really interesting, and a little early, because I think it's how the lesson is designed is changing. But they have this wonderful simulation called Lives in Balance that I did a little play testing for a few months ago, and I was excited to throw that into the mix here. It's sort of like a mixed media. Michelle, you can step in if I'm explaining this wrong. It's sort of like a mixed media, almost alternate reality type interface. It's like a platform, like a game, where you're working in a government with other members of the government, and a crisis is happening in real time, and like emails are coming out, and every day there's like a newspaper article, or the situation on the ground changes. So it's a little bit like a Model UN type situation, and you're sort of trying to deal with some sort of a crisis. Currently, the way iThrive is running it is it's iThrive run, like they develop the content, they would work with the classroom teachers to then implement it. But as I understand it, they're looking to make the module a little bit more open-ended so that anyone like me, for example, could kind of step in and design a lesson plan with it. And I thought to myself, doing something about genocide, or a genocide that was threatening to break out, even if it was fictional, would be an awesome activity for this. And it would be great at the beginning of the unit to get students right from the beginning thinking about how, well, it's easy to say from a moral standpoint, genocide is wrong, it's bad, only bad people would do something like that, and yet it happens anyway. And so why is that? Like, where is that messiness, that slippage when it comes to international politics, right? What ends up happening when the rubber meets the road, right? And I thought that this simulation would be a wonderful opportunity for students to see how politics and political interest and competing interest groups can ultimately lead to these things happening, even when we have a strong sense of morality that what is happening is wrong. So I just thought that was an awesome thing to include into the string. So that's just kind of a brief overview. I think I went over a couple minutes, my apologies. I would also add that I have written a short article about the string that I wrote, and I can throw that over in the chat if you want to read it. It goes into a lot more detail, so I can just throw that in now. But again, I'm really excited to be on the panel here, and I'm looking forward to some of the questions.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was fantastic. Just framing and explanation of your process. It's just amazing to see it all in action, and just understand where you were coming from, and building it, putting it together. And it's just a really, really fantastic string. So I hope that was helpful for everyone. I did also try to show a little bit what Sean meant as he was speaking to looking in search for content, looking through our library. All of these lessons are available through Composer, and then also in the Create Studio. That's what he was speaking to, where he was taking different materials and sort of mixing, matching, changing the order, in that interactive design studio in the Create section. So we'll jump into our panel discussion, and I'll leave the string up just for a few more moments. And feel free to jump in. So we'll start with what are your main takeaways from this string that Sean shared and put so much thought into, and what do you believe will be the main impact on students from this holistic journey? And also welcome to speak more to your specific content from your organization if you wish.
I'd love to jump in if that's okay. I wasn't sure if you wanted to start with this, but no. Okay, great.
Go for it.
So again, my name is Juanita from Generation Citizen. So Sean, thank you for creating this. I think this would be a very powerful string or unit or whatever you want to call it in your classroom. I love the idea, the fact that you incorporated different instances of genocide throughout history and throughout the world. It makes it so much more powerful, and that the realization that it's not an isolated event and that it can occur over and over. But I think for me and from the, the role that I'm in, the most powerful part is that students are able to think about what can I do? Like, what action can I take? And while, in this instance, you chose one of our writing an op-ed, there are other ways that you can explore that as an educator, and even give students an opportunity to think about what other ways do you want to think about it. With Generation Citizen, one of the things that we really strive to do is share power and ensure that our students feel like and have a lot of autonomy over what happens in the curriculum. It's really, there is enough structure that what's going on, but there's so much autonomy for students to really have agency and control over what the conversations are going to look like and what their project is going to look like. And I think this is a good example of that. Or you could even say as an educator, well, Sean created this fabulous string, but I want to focus on like these two. Let me see what my students want to focus on, and maybe do like a jigsaw, or, hey, in smaller groups, what do you want to do? And then bring it back together. So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach it, which is really exciting. But I love the fact that, like I said, there's like a lot of diversity. There's opportunity for choice, and there's a clear connection to what can I do? Because when we're having conversations about these really awful things that have happened in our history, it's difficult to think about it and not know, and overwhelming to think about it and not really know, what can I do? What can I do now? Thinking about, again, your example with the playground, it's like, well, what if this happens again? What actions can I take? What power do I have? So I really like that balance in this. So thanks for creating that.
Yeah, I'd love to piggyback on that. I really appreciate what you said, Juanita, about the focus on autonomy. And I think this string is nice in that it actually bookends the experience with that. It starts with this peak experience of lives in balance, where students are really in charge of how the conversation goes. It's really up to them to determine how they're going to advocate for their position, how they're going to come to consensus or not, and sort of how their own values and decision-making approaches really play into that. So I love that focus on autonomy, both in both of those places. I think that's so important for students to really enjoy it and get so much out of it. I also really appreciate how flexible and adaptable it is. I think teachers are going to be able to adopt it because there are different paths and different options. So that's always critically important. And also, I really love the opportunities right up front for setting norms and for really establishing some emotional resonance. I think you can't really go into conversations about genocide without that. So I think you've done a really fantastic job of setting the stage to say we're really going to address students holistically as they approach this topic.
And I would love to add, just piggybacking on the previous panelists, but as you were talking, Sean, I was familiarizing myself with some of the nuances of the website, and I scrolled over the little I circle next to understanding genocide, where it has the string outcomes. And keeping with our focus on civics and social emotional learning, it was really interesting looking at how each of those traditionally academic key terms and skill sets incorporated so much of social emotional learning, so much of civic responsibility. And I was immediately drawn to the one about engaging in dialogue over tough emotional topics, and thinking about the time that our students and our educators have been in the classroom environments, and just the focus on that in context to these huge historical events and trying to bring them to understanding. And correct me if I'm wrong, but after doing a quick search, it seems like this is one of the largest classroom session strings on Composer. And I do want to acknowledge that does highlight the complexity of bringing these topics into classroom with students. And the resources are varied from Armenia to the Holocaust, Nanjing, Rwanda, and looking at histories that may not be as commonly explored in classroom context. And I do have to personally thank you for the inclusion of Watcher of the Sky. And it was one of my favorite videos and resources that I used in the classroom. And still, every time I watch it, it impacts me as a professional and on a personal level. And I think so much of our core reason for being here and the objectives of the string are highlighted in that. And looking at how Ben Ferencz prosecuted and witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust, but his legacy, his work after that, spending decades on sharing his story, educating world leaders, educating students about why it's so important to teach these tough histories and to do the legwork to give to future generations. And while we know it hasn't necessarily prevented other genocides from happening, his purpose, his global civic responsibility, and his core work is always inspiring with me. And like you said, Sean, it's such a difficult topic to talk about, but having his voice in it looks at some of the positive impact that witnesses to the atrocities have had.
The role that bystanders can play.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all so much for all those thoughts. That's really, really fantastic. And yes, thank you for your reflections on the string. So stepping back, I think a little bit, like you're zooming out, if you will, from the string. What we talk about tough history or hard history, heavy history, whatever you want to call it. What are the benefits of this? Why are we addressing these topics with students, and what is the value in that to them? I know, Sean, you say, the depressing history teacher, right? So, why do we do that, and why is it important? I guess, Sean, if
Should
you
I
want.
start?
Yeah, you can kick us off if you like.
Okay. Well, yeah, I touched upon this a little bit, when I was talking earlier, that to me, it's really just a part of, for me, it's like my calling as a history teacher. I mean, I love history as a topic in itself, right? And I don't think that history, I actually push back against the notion that all history has to be instrumental to the present. I think that sometimes just learning about some weird crap that happened in the past is just like really entertaining and fun. And that's it. It's just an end in itself. It doesn't have to always be instrumentalized. And I think that students enjoy that as well. And so I think that there's a danger there that teachers, there's a trap that sometimes, we'll fall into, where everything we do has to be hammering on some lesson right now. And sometimes just like learning about how Romans used the bathroom is just kind of like really entertaining, and you don't need to, it doesn't need to connect anything. That said, as I said earlier, I mean, for me, like talking about these tough topics, I feel like because I've spent so much time studying it and learning, and I am an educator, that I'm one of the best people available. And I don't just mean me, I mean me as an educator is one of the best people available to talk about these topics, because if we're not, who is, right? Either no one, or you have the cable news media or the online world or Reddit, or any other platform where there's a lot of misunderstandings, there's a lot of misinformation. People aren't talking about the skills that you need to be able to think about these topics. They're just like, here's something to think, here's something to think. So how can we build the skills that are necessary for students making choices and taking actions that we want them to take? Because just simply telling them about terrible things that happened clearly isn't enough, right? And so I think that like what we've all kind of touched on today, and I think you're right to note that it was important to me, is then how do we move beyond the just sort of almost even fetishizing the criminal things that have happened in the past, to actually like, now how do we then get students to do things about it in a way that we want them to do, rather than just assuming that because we show them bad stuff, that then therefore they'll take actions to make bad stuff not happen any longer, which I think has kind of been the approach for a while.
Oh, I'm just making sure nobody unmuted. So, I mean, I think it's important to teach history that might make folks uncomfortable. I kind of struggle with calling it tough history. I think it's more of like, you might not be comfortable with this, like thinking about genocides. It's very uncomfortable to think about, that this could actually happen. But the fact that it happened is very important to discuss, because it happened to someone, and that someone's descendants, their great great grandkids, or even closer, given, depending on what event we're referring to, might be in that classroom, might live in that immediate community, might live in that larger community, and are impacted by choices that are being made within that community. So having an understanding of people's historical backgrounds is extremely important, and they should be acknowledged and understood and incorporated into understanding what different groups need in your community. It also goes back to what Sean said earlier, and some of the work that he's doing around empathy. Once you know a little bit more about challenges folks face, you can kind of practice. Young people are practicing that muscle, like really working on that skill and that competency and that ability to empathize with other people and make them just better citizens, better community members, and more likely to take action on things that are important, not just to them immediately or that impact them immediately, but impact their community at large. And again, these things are often patterns. Like, there wasn't just one instance of genocide that Sean highlighted, there were multiple. And thinking about our current events, and when students are looking at, hopefully they are looking at current events and watching the news, even if it's on Instagram or Twitter or whatever it is, hopefully they can make that connection of, oh, hey, like I learned this in school, like, is there something there? And it doesn't need to be triggered by a classroom conversation. It can be on their own, hopefully, after having practiced that skill in the classroom. So I think it's a really important thing. And again, really just the empathy part and the community part are critical here.
And I'll have to admit, just listening to comments, I probably revised and reflected upon my response about 10 times already to this question. And I started thinking about how you kicked it off and said the why, and just merging it into how we teach about this. And going back to one of our core resources, it's titled Holocaust and Human Behavior, and just the joining of those words in itself. And one of the first objectives of the resources provided is to recognize the human tendency to create in-groups and out-groups, and the consequences of that behavior on a society's universe of obligation. That's immediately taking a case history that is so hard to understand for so many reasons and bringing it into students' everyday lives, school communities, and classrooms. What happens when we see marginalization in the context of our school communities, in our extended communities? And using the case study, of course, intellectual rigor is important. We're all educators here tonight. So how do we use this case study to look at how a dictatorship came to power in a democracy? How were members of a society marginalized, rounded up, and murdered, who went a few years before from being veterans, from being politicians, from doctors, lawyers? How did that happen? How was it done under the cover of war? How do we wrestle with the choices that individuals, groups, and nations made when this was happening? And what contributed to those choices? Looking at these connections to these themes, how are they related to democracy, citizenship, racism, marginalization, and inclusion in the world that they live in today? And I think it comes back to the benefits are that students hopefully will start to understand their responsibilities that they have, the power that choices can have, to make choices and to try to help bring a more human, just, and compassionate community on the global level, but equally important as on their local level, in their classroom, in their towns. And obviously not easy objectives to achieve. And I think the important part of history too is allowing for students to bring in their personal histories and seeing how much of their personal histories shape their identity as students in our classrooms, and not ignoring that, and seeing the value that that can have as well into these conversations about these histories.
I'll also add, just in addition to all of that was so well said, I think we have an opportunity and a responsibility at a particular developmental moment and a particular generational moment to teach these topics. I think teens in particular are, we have an opportunity to earn their respect and trust when we don't try to sugarcoat, we don't try to manipulate, we try to bring in an honest conversation about what really happened, and also really take advantage of the fact that teens are oriented more than older generations to an idea of to equity and embracing diversity. And I think that this is a moment to really help them to focus on those things and build those skills at a time when their brains are really malleable and they're really, setting skills and mindsets to go forward into the future.
Michelle, I'm so glad that you said that, because one of the things that I meant to add was, in terms of this being really important, is that so often in history, we see young people at the forefront of change. You could probably name almost any movement that we've seen in world history, and young people are at the front, right? So what a great opportunity, what a great entry point for us to have those conversations with our young people in our classrooms. And it's a missed opportunity if you're not doing that, if you're not talking about the things that are happening even currently across the country and across the world with young people, making sure that their voices are heard and their communities are being served. But there are so many historical examples of this that why not elevate those? Like, perfect entry point. It's going to be motivating, or it's going to be captivating, and it's going to be relatable for our young people.
And I would love to jump in if it's okay and just expand on that too. It's like in teaching current events, it's so similar to like an iceberg, where the current events is what we see above water, but there's so many factors throughout history that brought us to that moment. So how are we introducing current events in our classrooms? Are we teaching them as isolated, disconnected moments? Or are we actually exploring the legacy, the memory that has led us to this moment? And how do we dive into those foundational experiences, those long histories, to show that, sure, this is a current event in your lifetime, but look at the moments in history that brought us to this peak, to this moment. And current events is always difficult to fit in terms of the context of everything that educators need to do during the context of their daily instruction, but looking at linking it to some of the already being taught aspects of their curriculum is such a meaningful way to connect the current events with that history.
It's wonderful discussion. Thank you all so much. I know we're running out of time faster than we'd like. We can definitely talk about this all day. So I just want to give a moment to address the SEL portion directly from Michelle, since iThrive is the expert there, and then also hear from Juanita on the civic engagement piece, since that is also the expertise area of Generation Citizen. So Michelle, what does integrating social emotional learning into history lessons look like, and how can we make it a priority as opposed to an add-on? And also, how can we support educators? These are also uncomfortable topics for educators to address too. So how can we support them in this work as well, not just students?
Yeah, thank you. It's a big question, so I'll try to be quick, and I'll address the second part first. So I think SEL, just from a really practical standpoint, should be a part of every district's comprehensive plan, and teachers should be given a central leadership role in determining how those efforts play out on the ground. And I also think it's important to be using evidence-based social emotional learning practices so that they're more likely to work. We see them bear fruit, and we encourage sticking with those efforts. I think it also will help if we change the mindset about social and emotional skills from this really frustrating designation of soft skills to essential skills. Actually, when SEL is done equitably and well, it is a step towards equity more broadly in preparing students for the future. So I think that's a really key mindset shift. And also, I think we really need to continue creating and making accessible to teachers high quality materials that embed SEL directly into academic instruction. So I know iThrive and other panelists here are really committed to doing that and striving to do that. And that's one reason that I love Composer, is it really puts that at teachers' fingertips. I think when it comes to integrating SEL into history and civics, I know at iThrive we like to say that civic learning is social and emotional. whenever you look beneath the politics and jargon, there's always the beating heart of human motivation. You can't ignore that. And actually, it's really important to use that as a scaffold. So, students, especially in middle and high school, are already highly attuned to social emotional cues. I think we really need to use those as a jumping off point to engage them in the academic content. And, like we mentioned before, really think about how they can have autonomy in some of those civic learning experiences so that we really increase their investment, which is why we love doing things like simulations. And finally, just in terms of supporting educators' own SEL, I know this is obvious and not a quick fix, but we need high quality opportunities for professional development that work with teachers' real lives in terms of building their own SEL. But I also think that we really need to be creating cultures both within and outside of school walls that are responsive and supportive to teachers as human beings. I think we need to model to them through resources and policies that their social emotional well-being matters in its own right. Not only that it's essential to everyone else's success, which it is. So I think, I hope that, when teachers feel cared for and empowered to find balance in their own lives, they're really much better equipped to meaningfully and consistently connect with students and model the kinds of skills we'd like to see students using, even when they're teaching really difficult content. I'll pass it on. I'm sorry, I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I really love to hear all that from you and from the iThrive perspective. Yeah, so now I'll pass it on to Juanita for the civic engagement piece. How can we support students in applying history lessons to action civics and civic engagement, and make the history lessons relevant to their lives today, inspire them to take action? I know you have actually touched on a lot of this, but definitely wanted to open up if you'd like to add anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with, I can certainly get into what we do specifically in our curriculum, which if I have time, I will, but I'll start with something really simple. And it's something that actually happened in my life. So I have an 11th grader. She's, obviously a junior in high school, and we went to parent teacher conference night, and we were learning about what content they're learning. And of course, as an educator, I'm like super excited about parent teacher conferences and learning what my kid's doing in school. So he shared that while teaching the history of unions and how they came about, he paused and had students reflect on what a living wage could or should be in this country. And they were tasked with creating a budget on different salaries, and it was group work and thinking about like, what is minimum wage? Is that a real living wage? And I thought that was all wonderful because he made that connection to today, and it definitely, invited more opportunity for conversation among students. And it's something, like a project-based approach to it. But what I had suggested for him to take it one step further is this action piece. Like, now what? Now what can we do? Now that we see that the minimum wage isn't truly a livable wage for most people in this country, what can we do about it? So giving them opportunities like, we already explored writing an op-ed, or maybe doing a little research and finding out what campaigns already exist around this topic that I can support, that I can be part of, is how you build in the action civics piece. And I share that example because it's something very simple that we can all be doing in our classrooms. It doesn't need to be a reinvention of your full curriculum. It's inserting that action piece, inserting that experiential learning. And it's young people actually getting involved. Again, I can get into examples of how we do it in our curriculum, and I'd be happy to offline with anyone. But I think it's just a good example of how it can actually be done.
Thank you so much, Juanita. So I think we will stay a few minutes and we can continue the conversation. I know we had a few questions from folks in the audience, but for those of you who need to hop off, just want to share that you can find us at composereducation.org. You can make an account for free. It is a completely free tool that you can access and find all of these resources that were shared from these fantastic content providers. Sean's string is also available. You can dig into that. You choose one of the branches that he's recommended. Adapt it for your students however you like. Sean, you're also welcome to drop the link for your article if you want to read more about his process. If you'd find that helpful for jumping into Composer. We also offer demo sessions. So if you sign up for Composer and you would like some personalized help in building your curriculum or just navigating the platform, please reach out to us. You can find us at support@composereducation.org. Kristen will drop that in the chat as well. And feel free to come with any questions or just reach out anytime. I'm always here for tech support. And this recording of this meeting, and as well as a link to Sean's string and his article, will be available in a follow-up email to everyone who registered. So thank you all so much for attending. Hope you enjoyed the program, and we will continue with one more question. So we had a question from one attendee in the chat. So thank you so much for your question, which was really important. So I wanted to give some time to this. The question was, how do you navigate through these difficult subjects with a younger audience? And how do you approach parents as well? I think that question was probably asked too, because the content in the string was geared towards high schoolers. So if a teacher wanted to address it with a younger audience, what would be some tips or thoughts, reflections on how to do that? I know, Juanita, you were a middle school teacher, so not to put you on the spot, but
no, that's
yeah.
totally fine. I mean, I think that, you know, I did teach US history, so not necessarily genocide or the specific content that Sean created or developed. But I think having open and honest conversations about things that happened and answering very honestly the questions that young people have, and they, Lord knows, they have questions about all of these things, and having resources that are just age appropriate and accessible. I mean, those I think are some of the obvious things as educators we want all of our students to have, regardless of their grade level, is making sure that the readings are accessible and they can understand it, and creating space. I think mostly what's probably most important is creating space to address questions and really think through what's happening and how it impacts, how it impacted folks during that specific time that you were discussing, and how it impacts folks today. So I'm thinking again, US history. So how do different events in US history impact our local community? Like we also did like in 6th grade Rhode Island history. So thinking about like Slater Mill or the Lowell girls or any of those things, what does that mean today for our community? Lowell is a great example. Like the community in Lowell, Massachusetts has changed drastically since that time. How has it changed? What does that mean for the community? What does that mean for all of the folks that have entered the community since then, which are mostly Latino, and I think there's a couple of other groups there. So what does that look like today? In terms of the parents, I think that's a critical piece, is to just be really open and honest with them too. With your reasoning for teaching this content, it's important history for young people to know. Bring them into the conversation, share content with them for them to read and understand it. Like almost all our classrooms use Google Classroom now. Like that's a great tool for parents to kind of peruse the content that their young people are looking at, and ask those questions and bring it up during the parent-teacher conferences, and just make it accessible for them too. Because a lot of times if a parent comes to you with upset that their young person is learning something, it might be because they don't really understand that part of history themselves, which is fine, so let's teach them too. Let's all have a conversation about it. So making it a community effort, as is with all things in education, is really important and helpful. I also dropped, just to throw a little plug in there, I dropped a link to a resource that we have called Kickstart Action Civics. I think someone asked about like paid and unpaid, free resources. That's one of the free resources that we provide. So if you're interested in learning about what Action Civics is and how it works, you can just log on there. It's multiple asynchronous modules that you can walk through, and our contact information is on there if you ever have questions.
So I just wanted to throw in real quick, having signed the string, that it is designed more towards a high school audience, but I really think it's scalable in a lot of ways, because the social emotional lessons the interactive lessons, writing an op-ed, participating in Lives in Balance. That's all sorts of, simulation type activities that middle school kids love and really thrive on. I think, the activities about in-grouping and labeling and stereotyping, middle schoolers would be just as attuned to that as high schoolers, perhaps more. And a lot of the lessons are organized in a way that middle schoolers would really enjoy them and really understand these complex concepts in a very simple way. I think the biggest concern with this thread in particular would be the content. And the content can get tough. And I think that, even when I teach seniors in high school, I think about the content that I talk about. College, university, I have a colleague who's been in some very public debates recently about discussing sexual assault and rape in the camps during the Holocaust and World War II, and what an emotionally sensitive and fraught topic that remains among adults, right? That's not something I'm going to discuss in a high school classroom probably, or certainly not a middle school classroom. So, for example, Hotel Rwanda. I don't think I would show Hotel Rwanda to middle schoolers, possibly not to ninth graders. But what I could do is show a couple scenes. I could select a scene or two that was emblematic of some larger thing that I wanted to discuss that was age appropriate, and then slot that in. So I think it's really that content piece and how deep you're going into it that's the part that matters. Everything else around it, I would say I think still works.
I also would add just, if you're planning to teach this content with younger students or with high school students, I think it doesn't really matter, but it may be more important even for the younger students. Make sure that you have the time built in to do a little bit of pre-work and a little bit of debrief. So make sure that, like Sean did with this string, this is a great chance if you're going to jump into content like this, I think, to revisit any norms that you've set and make sure that they are appropriate to the conversations that are going to happen, and make sure that students know what permission they have in terms of alternatives or opting out or, doing engaging in some other way if the content is too sensitive at any point. Also, I think making connections with school counseling staff where that's available can be really helpful and important. But also just, I think just don't jump right into an assessment if you're doing content like this. Make sure you give a little time for it to, this may be totally obvious, but, for students to really reflect on how it's hit them emotionally, give them some space to talk about that and to debrief it before you go to just sort of checking for understanding.
And not to keep everybody here longer, but just to respond to it, and facing history in ourselves is clear that the resources are intended more for upper middle and high school students. And even with that being said, while we're here recommending content, all of you are the experts on your students. And regardless of their age, what they can handle, what's going on in their lives, what might be impacting them in any one class period. And I think it might be obvious, but focusing on the social emotional learning aspect of this conversation, it's so important to build those connections, to build the rapport with students. And this isn't content that should just be left as part of like sub-plans. It takes investing yourselves in the time and knowing the resources and knowing how it may impact your students. And it's equally important how we bring students into the conversation and how we allow them to exit. So strategies like journaling, as Michelle mentioned, contracting, how students can share a voice without actually speaking in class, and ways to get in touch with you about something they're feeling are so important in looking at these. And as a classroom teacher, I would, no matter how much time I had when that bell rang, always thinking about, okay, where are my students going next? What is their next class going to be? And complicated so much in the virtual classroom environment too, of we don't have those connections when we were remote, but how do we still foster the relationship building to ensure that sense of safety, that sense of belonging for all our students as they leave some of these discussions as well.
Can I hop in one more time, Jacqueline?
Yeah,
or no, are we done?
absolutely.
Okay.
Most
So
folks
this is a
say,
piece.
so go for it.
I know, if you've gone, you've gone. I think one piece that we haven't really discussed here that I think is really important when we talk about different groups' histories and bringing those conversations into the classroom is the social power dynamics, the social group identities and how they play out. So, I'm specifically thinking about when we talk about racism in our classroom. And if you have students that are don't identify as people of color, they might feel more uncomfortable or even responsible, or the sense of individual burden because they have social power, because they have privilege. And while we want them to recognize that certain groups do have more privilege than others, and social power does exist, and systemic oppression is real, and all of those things, one of the things that we want to make sure is that they don't take on that individual burden, that there are people that do have social power, that do have privilege, who are also working really hard to challenge the status quo. There are white folks who do anti-racist work and do it really well. There are straight allies around queer rights, et cetera, like all of those examples. And the goal of any classroom should be to show how this privilege works around race, class, ability, or anything, and how they're institutionally maintained and secured in spite of individual successes to avoid them. So in spite of the work that individuals are doing to push against this status quo, there are things that are happening, right, that combat that. So I gave the example of racism because it's obviously a very big topic in our country right now, but that goes for any topic. You're going to have some students feeling that, again, individual burden. And we want them to make sure that they understand that that's not what we're here for. We're not here to attack any one group. We're here to think about how this impacts our community at large, and what you can do as an individual to support your community members.
And looping back to something Michelle said earlier, I found over the years that students tend to be a lot more responsive and open to me when you make that time for the social and emotional learning, right? And something Frank said about safety, right? Like that SEL to me has many benefits, but one of them is that it makes students feel more comfortable and safer in the classroom. And when they feel that way, they're more likely to share things that they wouldn't share otherwise. And they're more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt when you're taking them to a place that's uncomfortable, that they're not sure about, that they've heard other things from other people, and this is a little different. If they feel comfortable and safe with you, they're going to articulate that, or they're going to say, you know what, I'm going to listen to you, and they're not going to shut down. And I think that's something that's it's important to have that rapport, especially when you're talking about tough topics, right? Because if they just shut down and be like, oh, well, there goes teacher X, that's just their agenda, right? Then they're not hearing, they're not learning, they're not processing, and it really doesn't matter what you say. So again, just want to advocate for that social emotional piece, and making time for that as being just really, really important to what we do, and not a time waster, I think, as some people will think sometimes still for some reason.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you both so much. Thank you, Juanita, for addressing that. The levels of power and identities for students, and Sean for also, I think, the trust. That's really probably the underlying theme there. Wonderful. So I think we will actually wrap up now. Thank you all for everything, for all your great thoughts and expertise, and thank you to all our participants who remained on the webinar. Really appreciate you all. And again, you can find Composer at composereducation.org. It's a free resource, and you can access all of the resources that we mentioned today, from Facing History and iThrive and Generation Citizen, as well as Sean's String. And yes, thank you again. Please reach out if you have any questions, and you will, of course, receive a follow-up email. And thank you so much, panelists. Really appreciate you all. It's a joy to work with you all, a joy to have this conversation. Really, really important conversation. So thank you for all the work that you do and the impact that you have on teachers, students, and our world. All right, and with that, I will hop off. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.